The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the alkali flats of Death Valley, as if trying to scorch the very life from the earth itself. In the summer of 1897, this was considered the most inhospitable place in the American West, a furnace of stone and sand where even the Apache refused to venture during the day. The heat shimmers rising from the valley floor created phantom lakes that vanished as soon as a traveler drew near, leaving only cracked earth and the bleached bones of those who had believed the mirages. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine Kate Morrison pulled her wide-brimmed hat lower over her steel-gray eyes and urged her exhausted mare forward along what barely qualified as a trail. The 34-year-old widow carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had learned that showing weakness invited predators, both human and otherwise. Her dark blue traveling dress, now coated with a fine layer of alkali dust, had once been suitable for Sunday services in San Francisco. Now it served as armor against the hostile landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Kate had been traveling for 6 days since leaving the last outpost of civilization at Furnace Creek, following directions that had seemed questionable, even when delivered by the grizzled prospector who'd sold them to her for the price of a hot meal. Badwater Basin, he'd wheezed through tobacco-stained teeth. Follow the old Timbisha Trail south past the Devil's Golf Course, then east toward the Funeral Mountains. You'll know the place when you see it, valley within a valley, where the salt crystallizes in patterns that ain't natural. The description had seemed like the ramblings of a desert-addled mind, but Kate Morrison had learned to follow even unlikely leads when searching for her missing brother. Thomas Morrison had vanished 6 months earlier while conducting a geological survey for the Southern Pacific Railroad, along with his entire expedition team. The official report listed them as lost to hostile environment, but Kate had spent her inheritance tracking down every survivor, witness, and rumor that might lead to the truth. What she'd discovered defied easy explanation. Multiple accounts spoke of strange lights in Death Valley's Venus reaches, areas where compasses spun wildly and horses refused to proceed. Prospectors reported finding camps that had been abandoned mid-meal, with coffee still warm in tin cups but no trace of the men who'd been drinking it. Most disturbing were the testimonies of 3 separate witnesses who claimed to have seen riders in the distance, always 6 of them, always moving in perfect formation, always appearing when travelers ventured too deep into the valley's forbidden zones. The mare stumbled slightly, drawing Kate's attention back to the immediate danger of her situation. Her water was running low, and the nearest known source was still a day's ride away. In this heat, that might as well be on the moon. But Kate Morrison had not survived the deaths of her husband and parents, the loss of her family's shipping business to unscrupulous creditors, and 6 months of following cold trails across the Western Territories just to turn back at the first sign of difficulty. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change in subtle ways that Kate's trained eye, sharpened by years of managing complex business ledgers, couldn't help but notice. The salt formations grew more elaborate, creating geometric patterns that seemed too precise for natural formation. The rocks took on unusual colors, deep purples and greens that had no business existing in this monochrome wasteland. Most unnaturally, the oppressive heat began to ease, though the sun hung at the same merciless angle as before. Kate reined in her mare and studied her surroundings with growing unease. According to her compass, she was traveling due east toward the Funeral Mountains, but the peaks ahead didn't match the topographical descriptions she'd memorized. These mountains were too tall, too sharp, and they cast shadows that fell in the wrong directions. The very air seemed to shimmer with more than just heat distortion, as if reality itself was becoming unreliable. That's when she saw them. 6 riders crested a ridge perhaps half a mile distant, moving with the fluid precision of cavalry veterans. Even at that distance, Kate could see they were armed and riding with purpose rather than the casual pace of travelers. They appeared to be heading directly toward her position, though she couldn't imagine how they'd spotted her across the glaring expanse of salt flats. Kate's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 holstered at her hip, a gift from her late husband, who'd insisted that any woman traveling alone in the territories needed to be prepared for the worst humanity could offer. She'd become an excellent marksman during the long nights of her journey, practicing on tin cans and bottles until she could put 6 rounds center mass at 50 yards. But 6 against 1 were odds that even the finest shooting couldn't overcome. Riders approached at a steady lope, neither rushing nor hanging back, as if they had all the time in the world and knew exactly what they intended to do when they reached her. As they drew closer, Kate began to make out details that only deepened her confusion. Their clothing was a mixture of military and civilian styles. Some wore cavalry blue, others range clothes, but all were armed with rifles and moved with the coordinated discipline of a professional unit. Most strangely, despite the brutal heat that had Kate's dress soaked with perspiration, none of the approaching riders showed any signs of distress. No dust clung to their clothing, no sweat stained their shirts, and their horses moved with the fresh energy of animals that had just left a stable rather than been traveling under the desert sun. Kate Morrison had learned during her months of investigation that the impossible often had perfectly rational explanations if one was willing to dig deep enough. These men might be a military patrol on some classified mission, or perhaps mining company security protecting valuable claims. The fact that they showed no effects of the heat could be explained by superior preparation and equipment. But as the riders drew within 100 yards, Kate noticed details that challenged even her determined rationalism. The lead rider was a tall man with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades in the saddle, but his uniform bore insignia she didn't recognize, not U.S. Army, not state militia, not railroad security. The others were similarly equipped with gear that seemed both archaic and somehow advanced, as if military technology had developed along different lines than she knew. "Ma'am," the lead rider called as the group halted 20 feet away, his voice carrying clearly despite the distance and the strange acoustics of the valley. "You're heading into dangerous territory. I'm Captain Samuel Harrison, and these are my men. We strongly advise you to turn back immediately." Kate studied the 6 riders carefully. Captain Harrison appeared to be in his 50s, with the bearing of career military and eyes that had seen more action than most men survived. To his right sat a younger man with lieutenant's bars and the lean build of a scout or reconnaissance specialist. The others ranged in age from perhaps 25 to 40, all carrying themselves with the easy confidence of veterans who'd faced combat and lived to tell about it. "Captain Harrison," Kate replied, keeping her voice level and her hand near her weapon. "I'm Catherine Morrison, and I'm searching for my brother Thomas, who disappeared in this area 6 months ago while conducting a geological survey. I have reason to believe he may still be alive, and I won't be turning back until I find answers." Harrison's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching concern, though Kate caught a glimpse of what might have been respect in his weathered features. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand your determination, but you don't comprehend the nature of what lies ahead. This isn't a matter of hostile Indians or claim jumpers. There are forces in the deep valley that pose threats you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares." The lieutenant leaned forward in his saddle, his young face serious. "Ma'am, we've been patrolling this region for longer than you might believe. In all that time, civilians who venture past the warning markers don't come back. Your brother's expedition was the 4th group to disappear in these coordinates within the last 2 years. Kate felt her heart clench at the confirmation that Thomas's fate was part of a larger pattern, but she forced herself to focus on gathering information rather than giving in to grief. The 4th group? What happened to the others? And what exactly are you patrolling against? The 6 riders exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations. Finally, Captain Harrison spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of authority backed by hard experience. "Mrs. Morrison, there are some truths that civilians are better off not knowing. Suffice it to say that certain areas of Death Valley have been placed under military restriction due to natural phenomena that pose extreme danger to human life." "Natural phenomena," Kate repeated, her analytical mind picking apart the carefully chosen words. "Captain, I've spent 6 months investigating my brother's disappearance. I've interviewed prospectors, railroad surveyors, and Indian guides who've worked this territory for decades. The stories I've heard don't describe natural phenomena. They describe something that actively hunts human beings." Another exchange of meaningful looks passed between the riders. The youngest of them, a sandy-haired man who couldn't have been much older than 25, urged his horse forward slightly. "Captain, she's come this far on her own. That shows either remarkable skill or remarkable luck." "Maybe, Sergeant Williams," Harrison cut him off sharply. "Our orders are clear. No civilians pass the perimeter under any circumstances." Kate seized on the moment of apparent disagreement within the group. "Sergeant Williams, is it? You think I've shown skill in reaching this point? What if I told you I have information about the disappearances that your patrol might find valuable? Information that could help you understand what you're really facing out here." Williams glanced at his captain, clearly torn between orders and curiosity. "What kind of information, ma'am?" Kate reached slowly into her saddlebag, careful not to make any sudden movements that might provoke a hostile response. She withdrew a leather portfolio containing the documents and testimonies she'd collected during her investigation. Witness statements from 17 different sources dating back 3 years. Detailed accounts of the disappearances, including precise locations and circumstances. Geological survey notes from my brother's preliminary reports describing mineral formations and atmospheric phenomena that don't match any known scientific classification. Captain Harrison's stern expression wavered slightly. "You've been conducting your own investigation." "I have. And unless I'm mistaken, you and your men know more about what's happening in this valley than any official report has ever acknowledged. I'm proposing an exchange of information, what I've learned for what you can tell me about my brother's fate." The riders consulted among themselves in voices too low for Kate to overhear, but she could see the debate playing out in their body language. Harrison was clearly the commanding officer, but his men seemed to hold opinions that carried weight in their decision-making process. After several minutes of discussion, the captain turned back to Kate with an expression that mixed resignation with something that might have been admiration. "Mrs. Morrison, you've demonstrated remarkable persistence and courage in pursuing your investigation. However, what lies ahead is not something that can be faced by courage alone. If you insist on proceeding, you'll be entering territory where the normal laws of nature don't apply, where men with 20 years of combat experience have vanished without trace, and where the very landscape itself has become hostile to human presence." Kate met his gaze steadily. "Captain Harrison, I've lost everything that mattered to me except my brother. My husband died in a railroad accident, my parents succumbed to influenza, and creditors seized our family business while I was distracted by grief. Thomas is the only family I have left, and I won't abandon him to whatever horror lurks in this valley. If the terrain ahead is as dangerous as you claim, then I need to learn from men who've survived it." "Ma'am," Sergeant Williams interjected, earning another sharp look from his captain, "what you're asking for is training in methods that most folks would consider impossible. We're not just talking about survival skills or combat tactics. We're talking about techniques for dealing with forces that exist outside normal human experience." Kate's pulse quickened with the realization that she was finally getting close to the truth her months of investigation had been leading toward. "Sergeant, I've seen enough impossible things in the past 6 months to have a very open mind about what constitutes normal human experience. If my brother encountered something beyond conventional understanding, then I need to understand it too if I'm going to find him. Captain Harrison studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes weighing factors Kate could only guess at. Finally, he reached a decision that surprised even his own men. Mrs. Morrison, what we guard in Death Valley is a threat to human civilization itself. The techniques we've developed for containing that threat require discipline, courage, and a willingness to accept realities that would shatter most minds. Are you prepared to risk not just your life, but your sanity, for the chance to find your brother? Kate Morrison looked out across the impossible landscape of the deep valley, where salt crystals formed geometric patterns that defied nature and mountains, cast shadows in directions that violated the laws of physics. She thought of Thomas, whose geological expertise and scientific mind had drawn him into this nightmare, and of the 17 other people who had vanished trying to unlock Death Valley's secrets. "Captain Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the steel that had helped her survive the loss of everything she'd once held dear. "If my brother is alive in there, he's been surviving for 6 months using his scientific training and pure determination. I have the same training and the same determination, plus 6 months of investigation that your patrol apparently lacks. You say you need methods beyond normal human experience to face what's in that valley?" She urged her mare forward until she was close enough to see the scars and lines that decades of impossible duty had carved into Harrison's weathered face. "Then teach me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Harrison's weathered face remained impassive for several heartbeats after Kate's bold declaration, but she caught the subtle shift in his posture that suggested her words had struck something deeper than mere professional courtesy. The other 5 riders sat motionless in their saddles, creating a tableau that reminded Kate of a daguerreotype, too still, too perfectly composed to be entirely natural. "Mrs. Morrison," Harrison said finally, his voice carrying undertones she couldn't quite identify. "Teaching civilians our methods isn't a decision I can make lightly. What we guard here has claimed the lives of trained soldiers, experienced scouts, and men who thought they understood the nature of warfare. Your determination is admirable, but determination alone won't protect you from what lies in the deep valley." Sergeant Williams shifted in his saddle, and Kate noticed that his horse, a magnificent black stallion that should have been lathered with sweat in this heat, remained as fresh as if it had just left a stable. "Captain," Williams said carefully, "the lady's made it further into the restricted zone than any civilian in the past 2 years. And she's carrying documentation that might help us understand the pattern." "Pattern?" Kate seized on the word immediately. During her investigation, she'd begun to suspect that the disappearances weren't random, but followed some underlying logic that eluded conventional analysis. "You've identified a pattern in the incidents?" The lieutenant, a sharp-eyed man Kate, estimated to be in his early 30s, exchanged glances with his captain before speaking. "Ma'am, what we've observed suggests the phenomena in Death Valley respond to specific triggers, certain times, certain weather conditions, certain types of human activity. Your brother's geological survey team might have unknowingly activated something that had been dormant." Kate's analytical mind immediately began processing this information, cross-referencing it with the timeline she'd constructed from witness testimonies and official reports. "The disappearances cluster around the new moon," she said, pulling her notebook from her saddlebag. "I've mapped 17 incidents over the past 3 years, and 14 occurred during the dark moon phase. The other 3 happened during severe weather events, dust storms, flash floods, unseasonable cold snaps." Captain Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuine surprise Kate had seen him display. "You've mapped 17 incidents?" "Our records show only 12 confirmed disappearances in this sector." "Your records may be incomplete," Kate replied. opening her notebook to reveal pages covered with meticulous handwriting, sketches, and what appeared to be mathematical calculations. I've interviewed prospectors, railway workers, and tribal members who avoid the Deep Valley entirely. The official reports only cover incidents involving government personnel or major commercial expeditions. They don't account for individual prospectors, traveling salesmen, or small groups who simply vanished without anyone knowing where they'd gone. She handed the notebook to Sergeant Williams, who accepted it with obvious caution. As he flipped through the pages, his expression grew increasingly serious. "Captain, she's documented incidents we never heard about. This notation here, 3. Prospectors from Bakersfield. Disappeared March 15, 1895. Bodies found 3 weeks later in impossible locations. What does that mean, ma'am?" Kate had spent sleepless nights trying to understand that particular case. The bodies were discovered by a Paiute hunting party, sitting around a cold campfire in the exact center of a perfectly circular formation of salt crystals. No tracks leading to the site, no signs of struggle, no indication of how they'd gotten there. Most significantly, the site was 47 miles from where they'd been camped when last seen, in terrain so rough it would have taken 3 days of hard travel to reach on foot. The youngest rider, whom Kate judged to be barely out of his teens despite his military bearing, leaned forward with obvious fascination. 47 miles in impossible terrain? That's similar to the Richardson Party incident last October. "Private Jackson," Captain Harrison said sharply. "Operational security." "With respect, Captain," Jackson replied. "The lady already knows more about these incidents than our own intelligence reports. And she's figured out the lunar connection on her own that took our specialists 8 months to recognize." Kate felt a surge of vindication. Her months of painstaking investigation had not been the desperate delusions of a grieving woman, as so many officials had suggested. She had uncovered genuine patterns that even military intelligence had struggled to identify. "The lunar connection is just the beginning," she said. "I've also identified correlations with geological activity, atmospheric pressure changes, and what appear to be electromagnetic disturbances." Captain Harrison studied her with new intensity. "Electromagnetic disturbances? What led you to investigate that angle?" Kate opened her notebook to a section filled with technical drawings and measurements. "My brother Thomas was a trained geologist, but he was also fascinated by the new electrical sciences. His preliminary reports from Death Valley mentioned compass anomalies, unusual aurora-like phenomena despite the southern latitude, and what he described as electrical tension in the air that made his surveying instruments malfunction." She pointed to a detailed sketch that showed the valley's topography, marked with symbols indicating various types of disturbances. "I've correlated Thomas's observations with similar reports from other expeditions. The electromagnetic anomalies appear to radiate from specific locations in the Deep Valley locations that correspond exactly with the disappearance sites." Sergeant Williams finished examining the notebook and handed it back to Kate with obvious respect. "Captain, her analysis is more comprehensive than anything our technical staff has produced. She's identified connections we missed entirely." The older officer Kate had noticed earlier, a grizzled man with sergeant's stripes and scars that spoke of frontier warfare, finally spoke for the first time. "Ma'am, what you've documented here suggests you understand we're not dealing with conventional threats. Most folks who come out here are looking for gold or railroad routes or some other normal pursuit. You're tracking something that operates by different rules entirely." Kate met his gaze steadily. Sergeant Major Reeves, ma'am. Been fighting strange wars in strange places for longer than I care to remember." "Sergeant Major Reeves, I've learned that when conventional explanations fail consistently, it's time to consider unconventional possibilities. My husband was a practical manor railroad engineer who believed in steam, pressure and steel rails, and nothing he couldn't measure with instruments. But even he encountered things during construction projects that didn't fit into any textbook. She paused, remembering conversations that had seemed like mere curiosities at the time, but now took on ominous significance. Railroad crews working in remote areas sometimes reported equipment failures that couldn't be explained, work sites that were mysteriously altered overnight, and sections of track that seemed to shift position despite being anchored in solid bedrock. The company always blamed sabotage or poor craftsmanship, but the pattern was too consistent for random human interference. Captain Harrison dismounted from his horse with fluid grace, and Kate noticed that his boots made no sound when they touched the salt-crusted ground. "Mrs. Morrison, what you're describing aligns with phenomena we've observed across the Western Territories. Death Valley appears to be a focal point for disturbances that extend far beyond this immediate region." The revelation that this was part of a larger pattern sent chills through Kate despite the blazing heat. "How large a region are we talking about, Captain?" Reports of similar incidents stretch from the Colorado Plateau to the California coast, from the Mexican border to the Oregon Territory. Lieutenant Davis. Kate finally caught his name, replied. "But Death Valley represents the most concentrated and persistent manifestation of whatever force is responsible." Kate studied the 6 riders with growing understanding. "You're not just a patrol unit, are you? You're specialists, experts trained to deal with supernatural threats across the entire frontier. That's a conversation for when we're not standing exposed in hostile territory," Captain Harrison said, scanning the horizon with obvious concern. "Mrs. Morrison, your documentation has convinced me that you possess both the analytical skills and the courage necessary for what we do. But training begins with survival. And survival begins with understanding that Death Valley's dangers aren't limited to the deep regions you're trying to reach." As if summoned by his words, the air around them began to shimmer with distortions that had nothing to do with heat. The perfectly blue sky took on an opalescent quality, like oil on water, and Kate felt her skin prickle with what seemed like static electricity. Her mare snorted nervously and began backing away from something only the animal could sense. "Atmospheric disturbance," Sergeant Williams reported. Consulting a device Kate hadn't noticed before, something that resembled a compass, but was covered with dials and indicators that served no navigational purpose she could identify. "Magnitude 3, duration uncertain." The other riders immediately arranged themselves in a defensive formation around Kate, their weapons ready but not aimed at any visible threat. Captain Harrison moved to her side with predatory speed, his hand resting on what appeared to be a modified rifle, unlike any military weapon she'd seen. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "your first lesson begins now. When reality becomes unstable in Death Valley, the key to survival is maintaining mental discipline. Don't trust your eyes, don't trust your ears, and don't trust your instincts. Trust only the mathematical constants your brother would have understood: distance, direction, time, and basic physics." The landscape around them was beginning to shift in ways that made Kate's trained mind reel. The mountains in the distance seemed to be growing taller, their peaks stretching toward a sky that was simultaneously noon-bright and filled with stars. The salt flats beneath their horses' hooves reflected images that didn't match their surroundings, glimpses of forests, cities, and vast bodies of water that had no business existing in this desert wasteland. "What's happening?" Kate managed to ask, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "The barrier between dimensions grows thin," Sergeant Major Reeves replied matter-of-factly, as if discussing weather conditions. "Something on the other side is pressing against our reality, trying to break through. These manifestations usually last 5 to 10 minutes, but they're getting stronger and more frequent." Kate forced herself to apply the scientific method that Thomas had taught her, observing and analyzing rather than simply reacting with fear. "The electromagnetic disturbances I documented, they're not caused by geological phenomena. They're caused by dimensional instability." "Very good," Captain Harrison said approvingly. Your brother reached the same conclusion in his final reports. Unfortunately, understanding the nature of the threat isn't the same as being prepared to face it. A sound like breaking glass filled the air, though Kate could see nothing that might have shattered. The phantom images in the salt flats grew more vivid and disturbing. Cities, populated by figures that moved in impossible ways, forests where the trees appeared to be made of crystallized light, and vast caverns that seemed to extend infinitely into darkness that was more than mere absence of illumination. Magnitude 4, Sergeant Williams reported, his voice tight with concentration. We're approaching the threshold where manifestations can become self-sustaining. Kate's mare was now trembling with terror, but Kate herself felt an unexpected calm settling over her. This was the answer she'd been seeking for 6 months, the explanation for Thomas's disappearance and all the other mysteries that had plagued Death Valley. Whatever lay on the other side of reality's barrier was trying to break through, and her brother had somehow become caught in the process. "Captain Harrison," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, "if these manifestations are getting stronger and more frequent, that suggests the barrier is weakening. How long before it fails completely?" The captain's grim expression told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. "Our best estimates suggest complete dimensional collapse within 6 months. When that happens, the entities on the other side won't just be able to manifest temporarily. They'll be able to establish permanent footholds in our reality. And my brother? If Thomas Morrison is still alive, he's trapped somewhere between dimensions, existing in a state that's neither fully in our world nor fully in theirs. Recovering him would require entering the dimensional rift directly, a mission that every man here has been trained for, but that no civilian has ever attempted and survived." The atmospheric disturbance was beginning to subside, the phantom images fading back into normal salt flat reflections, and the sky returning to its natural desert blue. But Kate had seen enough to understand that her quest to find Thomas had evolved into something far more significant than a personal rescue mission. "Captain," she said as the last of the reality distortions faded away, "if dimensional collapse would threaten the entire region, then preventing it serves more than just my personal interests. Training me to help with that mission serves the greater good." Captain Harrison studied her with new respect, recognizing in her words the same sense of duty that had driven him and his men to accept their impossible assignment. "Mrs. Morrison, what we're offering isn't training in conventional military tactics. We're offering initiation into methods that will fundamentally change how you understand the nature of reality itself. Are you prepared for that transformation?" "Kate." Morrison looked out across Death Valley's deceptive landscape, where the impossible had become routine and the unthinkable had become necessary. She thought of Thomas, whose scientific curiosity had led him into this nightmare, and of the countless others who would suffer if the dimensional barrier failed completely. "Captain Harrison," she said, "I've already been transformed by what I've learned in the past 6 months. The only question now is whether that transformation will make me strong enough to help save my brother and prevent a catastrophe that could affect the entire frontier." "Then your real education begins now," Harrison replied. "But first, we need to reach our base of operations before the next manifestation cycle begins. In Death Valley, Mrs. Morrison, timing is everything." The ride to Captain Harrison's base of operations took them deeper into Death Valley's most forbidding terrain, following paths that seemed to exist only when the riders needed them. Kate had expected a military encampment, tents, supply wagons, the organized chaos of frontier cavalry. Instead, they approached what appeared to be an ancient Paiute settlement nestled against a cliff face, its stone structures so perfectly integrated with the natural rock formations that they became visible only when viewed from precisely the right angle. "This place predates European settlement by at least 500 years, Captain Harrison explained as they dismounted near what Kate gradually realized was a sophisticated defensive position. The original inhabitants understood Death Valley's true nature and built accordingly. We've simply adapted their wisdom to our purposes. Kate studied the settlement with growing fascination. The stone buildings weren't just camouflage, they seemed to bend light around them, creating optical illusions that would make aerial reconnaissance impossible. More intriguingly, the structures incorporated the same geometric patterns she'd noticed in the salt formations, suggesting the settlement itself was designed to interact with Death Valley's dimensional instabilities. "Captain," she said, running her hand along carved symbols that covered the nearest wall, "these aren't Paiute designs. The mathematical precision is consistent with the patterns I've documented, but the execution suggests knowledge of advanced engineering principles." Sergeant Major Reeves stepped beside her, his scarred hands tracing the same symbols with obvious familiarity. The people who built this place had encounters with the other side long before any of us arrived. They learned to work with forces that European science is only beginning to acknowledge. As they entered the settlement's central courtyard, Kate was surprised to discover it was much larger than external appearances suggested. Buildings that had seemed modest from outside revealed spacious interiors carved directly into the cliff face, connected by tunnels that extended deep into the mountain. The whole complex appeared to be a hybrid of ancient stonework and modern military engineering, equipped with devices that served purposes she couldn't immediately identify. "Mrs. Morrison," Lieutenant Davis said, gesturing toward a low building. "At the courtyard's eastern edge, we've prepared quarters for you. But before you rest, Captain Harrison would like you to meet someone who can provide context for what we're asking you to undertake." Kate followed Davis through a doorway that opened into a surprisingly comfortable chamber lit by oil lamps, arranged in patterns that seemed to generate more illumination than their flame should have produced. Seated at a wooden table covered with maps, charts, and what appeared to be scientific instruments was a woman perhaps 10 years Kate's senior, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that reflected the kind of deep intelligence Kate associated with university professors. "Mrs. Morrison," the woman said, rising with a slight smile, "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, formerly of the Smithsonian Institution's Anthropological Division. Captain Harrison thought you might appreciate hearing from someone who chose this life rather than having it thrust upon them." Kate accepted Dr. Hawthorne's offered handshake, noting the woman's calloused palms and the confident grip of someone accustomed to physical labor, despite her academic background. "Dr. Hawthorne, what brought a Smithsonian researcher to Death Valley?" "The same thing that brought you here, a missing family member and questions that conventional science couldn't answer." Dr. Hawthorne gestured for Kate to sit, then poured tea from a pot that seemed to maintain perfect temperature despite no visible heat source. "My younger sister Margaret was part of an archaeological expedition that disappeared in 1894 while investigating reports of pre-Columbian ruins in Death Valley's northern reaches." The parallel to Kate's situation was immediately apparent, but Dr. Hawthorne's presence suggested outcomes Kate hadn't dared hope for. "You found her?" "I found what she had become," Dr. Hawthorne replied carefully. "Margaret didn't die in Death Valley, she was transformed by it. The expedition encountered one of the dimensional rifts during a particularly severe manifestation event. Most of the team was lost, but Margaret somehow adapted to existence between realities. She now serves as a liaison between our dimension and whatever lies beyond the barrier." Kate felt her breath catch. "She's alive but not human anymore?" "She's human in all the ways that matter: consciousness, memory, emotional connections. But she exists in a state that allows her to perceive and interact with entities from the other dimension. It's that capability that makes our mission possible. Without Margaret's insights, we would have no understanding of what we're truly facing." Dr. Hawthorne opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several photographs that made Kate's analytical mind struggle to process what she was seeing. The images showed a woman who was recognizably human, but surrounded by geometric patterns of light. that seemed to extend into dimensions the camera couldn't properly capture. Her eyes reflected knowledge of realities that normal human perception couldn't encompass. The transformation process is dangerous and irreversible, Dr. Hawthorne continued. But for those with the right combination of scientific training, mental discipline, and emotional motivation, it can provide capabilities that normal human consciousness can't achieve. Your brother may have undergone a similar change. Kate studied the photographs with growing excitement and dread. If Thomas had experienced this transformation, he might indeed be alive, but in a state so fundamentally altered that rescue in any conventional sense might be impossible. What would that mean for any attempt to recover him? It would mean that recovery and rescue are two very different objectives, Captain Harrison said, entering the chamber with the rest of his team. Someone who has adapted to interdimensional existence can't simply return to normal human life, but they can serve as bridges between realities, helping to maintain the barrier that protects our dimension from invasion. Kate felt the weight of implication settling over her. The mission she'd envisioned finding Thomas and bringing him home to resume their normal lives was based on assumptions that no longer applied. But the alternative he'd suggested offered possibilities she hadn't considered. You're saying Thomas might not need to be rescued. He might need to be contacted and enlisted. If he's survived the transformation process and retained his human consciousness, Sergeant Williams confirmed, he could provide intelligence about the entities threatening dimensional stability. More importantly, he could help us develop countermeasures that work from the other side of the barrier. Dr. Hawthorne refilled Kate's teacup with liquid that tasted like nothing she'd ever experienced, somehow both earthy and ethereal, warming her body while sharpening her mental focus. Mrs. Morrison, what Captain Harrison and his team are offering you isn't just training in unconventional warfare. They're offering initiation into a way of life that exists at the intersection of science and what most people would call magic. Magic? Kate's analytical mind rebelled at the term, despite everything she'd witnessed. Advanced science that operates by principles we're only beginning to understand, Captain Harrison clarified. The entities from the other dimension possess capabilities that seem magical to us, but they're actually applications of physical laws that govern higher dimensional space. Learning to interact with those forces requires expanding human consciousness beyond its normal limitations. Sergeant Major Reeves pulled out a chair and sat across from Kate, his weathered face serious. Ma'am, I was a career cavalry officer for 20 years before I encountered my first dimensional manifestation. Lost half my troop to entities that could appear and disappear at will, that could turn solid matter into something like mist, that could make a man forget his own name while leaving his tactical knowledge intact. He paused, clearly remembering events that had fundamentally changed his understanding of reality. The Army declared us all casualties of an Apache raid and buried empty coffins with full military honors. But Captain Harrison found me 3 days later, half mad with grief and confusion, and offered me a choice: spend the rest of my life in an asylum trying to convince doctors that impossible things had happened, or learn to fight back against the forces that had destroyed my unit. Kate could see the pain those memories still caused, but also the sense of purpose that had grown from that tragedy. How many others have made similar choices? More than you'd expect. Fewer than we need. Lieutenant Davis replied. The phenomena we're fighting aren't limited to Death Valley. They're manifestations of a dimensional instability that affects the entire frontier. We have small teams operating from the Canadian border to Mexico, all working to maintain barriers that most of the world doesn't know exist. Private Jackson, the youngest member of the team, spoke up for the first time since their encounter with the atmospheric disturbance. Ma'am, I was a railroad telegrapher before I joined this unit. Started noticing that messages sent through certain areas arrived changed, different words, different meanings, sometimes written in languages that didn't exist. The railroad company blamed equipment failure, but I knew the equipment was working perfectly. He pulled out a small device that resembled a telegraph key, but was connected to mechanisms Kate didn't recognize. Turned out the dimensional instabilities were interfering with electromagnetic transmissions, sometimes routing messages through other realities before they reached their intended destinations. Learning to compensate for those effects taught me that communication isn't limited to the technologies we understand. Kate began to grasp the true scope of what she was being offered. These weren't just soldiers fighting an unconventional enemy. They were pioneers exploring the frontiers of human consciousness itself, developing capabilities that expanded the very definition of what humans could accomplish. Dr. Hawthorne, she said, when you began training with this unit, what was the most difficult aspect of the transition? Accepting that everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality was incomplete. Dr. Hawthorne replied without hesitation. I had spent my career studying human cultures and their mythologies, dismissing accounts of supernatural phenomena as primitive misunderstandings of natural events. Learning that those primitive peoples had actually developed sophisticated methods for dealing with interdimensional threats required abandoning decades of academic conditioning. She gestured toward the carved symbols that covered the chamber's walls. These designs aren't decorative art or religious symbolism. They're mathematical formulas for manipulating dimensional barriers, developed by cultures that understood death valley's true nature long before European science existed. My first lesson was learning to read them as technical diagrams rather than artistic expressions. Captain Harrison moved to a large map mounted on the wall, its surface covered with markings. That seemed to shift and change as Kate watched. Mrs. Morrison, your investigation has already demonstrated that you possess the analytical skills necessary for this work. Your documentation of patterns and correlations shows intellectual flexibility that many trained scientists lack. But the training itself requires more than analytical ability. He pointed to various locations on the map, each marked with symbols that corresponded to the carved designs around them. Each of these sites represents a dimensional weak point that requires constant monitoring. The entities on the other side are intelligent and adaptive. They learn from each attempted incursion, developing new methods for breaching the barriers. Our response must be equally adaptive. Kate studied the map with growing understanding. You're not just defending against random supernatural attacks. You're engaged in a strategic campaign against an organized enemy that operates by rules you're still learning. Exactly, Captain Harrison confirmed. And that enemy has a significant advantage. They understand the nature of higher dimensional physics in ways that our science is only beginning to approach. We've had to develop our capabilities through practical experience, learning from each encounter and building on knowledge passed down by indigenous peoples who faced similar threats. The magnitude of what she was contemplating settled over Kate like a physical weight. She had come to Death Valley seeking her missing brother and answers to unexplained disappearances. Instead, she had discovered a hidden war between dimensions, fought by a small group of individuals who had sacrificed conventional lives to protect humanity from threats it couldn't even imagine. Captain Harrison, she said finally, if I agree to this training, what happens to my search for Thomas? Your search for Thomas becomes part of a larger mission to prevent dimensional collapse, he replied. But understanding that mission requires knowing the full history of what we're fighting, the origins of the dimensional barriers, the nature of the entities trying to breach them, and the true scope of the threat we face. Kate Morrison looked around the chamber at the faces of people who had made choices similar to the one she was contemplating. Each had sacrificed normal life for duty to a cause that demanded everything while offering no conventional rewards. But in their eyes, she saw something she hadn't experienced since losing her family, a sense of belonging to something larger and more meaningful than personal survival. Then I need to understand everything, she said, her voice carrying the determination that had carried her across a continent in pursuit of impossible answers. I need to know what we're really fighting and what victory would look like. Captain. Harrison smiled for the first time since their meeting began. Mrs. Morrison, that education begins with meeting the entities themselves, under controlled conditions that will test every assumption you've ever held about the nature of human existence. The controlled encounter with entities from beyond. The dimensional barrier took place in a chamber Kate hadn't noticed during her initial tour of the settlement. Hidden beneath the main complex, accessible only through a tunnel that seemed to bend space itself, the containment facility represented technology that defied every scientific principle she thought she understood. The chamber's walls were lined with the same geometric patterns that appeared throughout Death Valley. But here they pulsed with visible energy that created a hypnotic interplay of light and shadow. At the center of the room stood what Dr. Hawthorne had called a dimensional viewing apparatus, a crystalline structure, roughly the size of a church bell that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human vision could properly process. Mrs. Morrison, Captain Harrison said as they descended the spiraling stone staircase that led to the chamber. What you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the boundaries between life and death. Are you prepared for that level of revelation? Kate gripped the stone railing, noting that her palms were sweating despite the chamber's cool temperature. Captain, I've spent 6 months investigating impossible disappearances and documenting phenomena that conventional science insists can't exist. I'm as prepared as anyone can be for the impossible. Dr. Hawthorne activated a series of mechanisms that caused the crystalline structure to emit a low harmonic tone that seemed to resonate in Kate's bones. The entities we're about to contact exist in a state of consciousness that transcends individual identity as we understand it. They think collectively, across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Communication requires expanding your awareness beyond the limitations of single-person perspective. The chamber filled with a luminescence that came from no identifiable source, and Kate felt her perception beginning to shift in ways that made her question the reliability of her own senses. The walls seemed to recede infinitely while simultaneously pressing closer, and she could swear she heard voices speaking in harmonious patterns that bypassed her ears entirely and resonated directly in her mind. Don't fight the sensation, Sergeant Williams advised, his voice sounding distant despite his proximity. The dimensional interface requires surrendering conscious control over perception. Think of it as allowing your mind to tune to frequencies that normal human consciousness can't detect. Kate closed her eyes and tried to apply the mental discipline techniques she developed during years of complex business calculations. Instead of forcing her awareness to remain within familiar boundaries, she allowed it to expand, following the harmonic resonance wherever it led. The result was unlike anything she could have imagined. Suddenly, she was perceiving the chamber from multiple perspectives, simultaneously seeing herself from above, from the side, from angles that existed outside three-dimensional space. But more remarkably, she was also perceiving the chamber as it existed in other dimensional layers, where the stone walls became transparent and revealed the vast network of energy patterns that connected Death Valley to similar sites across the continent. Fascinating, a voice said directly into her consciousness, bypassing her ears entirely. This one adapts quickly to expanded perception. Her mind structures show unusual flexibility for a human consciousness that has not undergone transformation. Kate realized with a start that she was hearing the entity they had come to contact, not hearing in any conventional sense, but receiving direct mental communication from an intelligence that existed beyond the dimensional barrier. The voice carried undertones of vast age and accumulated knowledge that made her feel like a child in comparison. You are the one seeking the consciousness designated Thomas Morrison, the entity continued, and Kate felt her emotional reaction to her brother's name ripple through the dimensional interface. His pattern remains active within our realm, though substantially altered by proximity to our collective awareness. He's alive? Kate managed to project the thought with enough clarity for the entity to receive it. The concepts alive and dead have limited meaning for consciousness that exists between dimensional boundaries. The entity replied, Thomas Morrison retains individual identity and memory, but his awareness has expanded to encompass multiple reality layers simultaneously. He has become what your species might term a hybrid consciousness. Kate felt Captain Harrison's hand on her shoulder, anchoring her to her physical body as the dimensional contact threatened to draw her awareness completely into the other realm. Ask about the dimensional instabilities, he whispered. Find out why the barriers are weakening. She focused her thoughts carefully, trying to frame the question in terms the entity would understand. The barriers between dimensions, why are they failing? Is your realm trying to invade ours? The entity's response carried what Kate could only describe as amusement, mixed with something approaching sadness. The barriers were never meant to be permanent. They were established as temporary protective measures while your species developed sufficient consciousness to interact safely with higher dimensional reality. The failure you perceive is actually the natural progression toward dimensional integration. This revelation struck Kate like a physical blow. Everything she'd been told about defending against invasion was apparently based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. You're not trying to invade our dimension. You're trying to help us evolve. Some among your species possess the capacity for expanded consciousness that would allow beneficial integration. Others remain locked in three-dimensional perception and would be destroyed by contact with higher dimensional reality. The challenge is facilitating evolution for those capable of advancement while protecting those who are not. Dr. Hawthorne leaned forward, her academic training apparently allowing her to formulate more sophisticated questions. The disappearances in Death Valley, are they forced transformations or voluntary evolutions? Both and neither, the entity replied in a way that somehow conveyed complex meaning beyond the simple words. Individuals drawn to dimensional weak points are responding to resonance patterns that indicate compatibility with expanded consciousness. The transformation process is neither voluntary nor involuntary in terms your language can adequately express. It is inevitable for those whose awareness seeks boundaries beyond three-dimensional limitation. Kate felt the implications of this explanation reshaping her understanding of everything that had happened to Thomas. He hadn't been the victim of supernatural predation. He'd been drawn to Death Valley by subconscious recognition that his consciousness was capable of evolutionary advancement. The geological survey had been merely the rational justification for a journey his deeper awareness had already decided to make. The collective designated Thomas Morrison serves as a communication interface between dimensional layers, the entity continued, apparently reading Kate's emotional response to this revelation. His scientific training provides analytical frameworks that facilitate translation between three-dimensional and higher-dimensional concepts. He has requested contact with the consciousness-designated Catherine Morrison. Kate's heart leaped at the possibility of direct communication with her brother. Can you arrange that contact? Such contact requires partial dimensional displacement of your consciousness. The process carries risk of permanent transformation. Are you prepared to accept that risk? Before Kate could respond, the crystalline apparatus began emitting harmonics that suggested imminent communication from an entirely different source. The chamber filled with energy patterns that felt familiar in ways Kate couldn't immediately identify, until she realized she was sensing the unique consciousness signature that had always characterized her brother's thought patterns. Katie? Thomas's voice came through the dimensional interface with perfect clarity, carrying all the warmth and affection she remembered from their childhood. My God, I can't believe you found this place. How long have I been gone? Kate felt tears streaming down her face as she responded to the brother she thought she'd lost forever. 6 months, Tommy. I've been searching for you for 6 months. 6 months? Thomas's confusion rippled through the dimensional connection. From my perspective, it's been years, decades maybe. Time doesn't function normally here. Katie, I need to explain what happened to me. What's happening to our reality? The communication felt exactly like conversations they'd shared throughout their lives, despite the impossible circumstances. Thomas retained his personality, his memories, his essential identity, but Kate could sense vast layers of awareness that hadn't existed before his transformation. The expedition discovered something that wasn't supposed to be found yet, Thomas continued. Crystalline formations that served as communication nodes between dimensions. We thought they were unusual mineral deposits, but they were actually consciousness interface devices left by a previous iteration of human civilization. This revelation staggered Kate's understanding of history itself. Previous iteration? You mean this has happened before? Multiple times, Thomas confirmed. Human consciousness periodically reaches developmental thresholds that require dimensional evolution. Those who can adapt survive the transition and help guide the next phase of species development. Those who can't adapt are protected by barrier systems until their descendants develop the necessary capabilities. Captain Harrison stepped closer to the crystalline apparatus, his expression reflecting the same shock Kate felt. Are you saying the dimensional barriers aren't protecting us from alien invaders, but from evolutionary pressures we're not ready to handle? The entities you've been fighting aren't invaders, Thomas replied. They're advanced human consciousnesses from previous evolutionary cycles, trying to facilitate the current transition while minimizing casualties among those not ready for dimensional expansion. The implications of this revelation reframed everything Kate thought she understood about the conflict in Death Valley. The mysterious guardians weren't defending humanity against supernatural threats. They were managing a species-wide evolutionary process that had been ongoing for millennia. Tommy, Kate said, struggling to process the magnitude of what she was learning. If this is natural evolution, why does it feel like warfare? Why are people disappearing and dying? Because the transition is happening too quickly, Thomas replied, his mental voice carrying deep concern. Something has accelerated the evolutionary timeline beyond safe parameters. Consciousness that should have centuries to develop gradually is being forced to adapt within decades. Many individuals are being drawn to dimensional interfaces before they're psychologically prepared for transformation. Dr. Hawthorne's academic instincts engaged immediately. What could cause such acceleration? Industrial technology, Thomas explained. Railroads, telegraph systems, mining operations, they're inadvertently amplifying the resonance patterns that connect dimensional weak points. What should be gradual evolutionary pressure is becoming a cascade effect that threatens to destabilize the entire transition process. Kate felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The electromagnetic disturbances I documented, they're not caused by dimensional instabilities. They're caused by industrial technology interfering with a natural evolutionary process. Exactly, Thomas confirmed. The challenge isn't stopping evolution, it's managing the pace of change so that consciousness can adapt safely. Some individuals will always be ready for advancement ahead of schedule. Others need protection until their descendants develop the necessary capabilities. Captain Harrison had been listening with growing understanding of how fundamentally their mission had been misunderstood. Thomas, are you saying our role should be facilitation rather than resistance? Your role is selection and timing, Thomas replied. Help those ready for advancement find safe paths to transformation. Protect those not yet ready from premature exposure to evolutionary pressures. Most importantly, regulate the industrial activities that are destabilizing the natural timeline. Kate realized that her search for her missing brother had led her to discover humanity's most significant developmental crisis. Tommy, Can you help us develop methods for identifying who's ready for advancement and who needs protection? That's exactly what I've been working on, Thomas said, and Kate could sense vast satisfaction in his mental voice. The consciousness network I've joined has been developing assessment techniques in transition, protocols that could make the evolutionary process much safer. But implementing them requires cooperation between three-dimensional and higher-dimensional awareness, which means we need people who can function in both states of consciousness, Dr. Hawthorne concluded. People like you, Katie, Thomas said directly to his sister. Your analytical mind combined with emotional motivation creates optimal conditions for controlled transformation. You could serve as a bridge between dimensions while retaining enough three-dimensional awareness to communicate with those not yet ready for evolution. Kate felt the weight of an impossible choice settling over her. The training Captain Harrison had offered was actually preparation for voluntary transformation into a hybrid consciousness that could help manage humanity's evolutionary transition. It would mean sacrificing her normal human existence, but it would also mean contributing to something vastly more significant and personal survival. What would that transformation involve? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Would fundamentally change the course of her life. A controlled expansion of consciousness that maintains individual identity while gaining access to higher dimensional awareness, Thomas explained. You would still be you, Katie, but you would also become part of something larger, a network of evolved consciousness, dedicated to guiding the species through its next developmental phase. As the dimensional communication continued, Kate began to understand that her journey to Death Valley had never really been about rescuing her brother. It had been about discovering her own role in humanity's future, and choosing whether to accept responsibilities that extended far beyond personal desires or conventional understanding of human limitation. The emergency assembly began before dawn, triggered by electromagnetic readings that surged beyond anything Dr. Hawthorne's instruments had ever recorded. Kate found herself awakened not by sound, but by a harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate directly in her bones, a phenomenon she was beginning to recognize as dimensional activity approaching critical thresholds. Mrs. Morrison, private. Jackson called through her chamber door. Captain Harrison requests your immediate presence in the command center. We're receiving coordinated signals from 7 different dimensional interface sites across the territory. Kate dressed quickly, noting that the carved symbols on her chamber walls were now glowing with their own luminescence, visual indicator that the settlement's protective systems were responding to elevated threat levels. As she made her way through corridors that seemed to pulse with increasing energy, she encountered other team members moving with the urgent efficiency of soldiers responding to battle stations. The command center proved to be the settlement's most sophisticated facility, hidden beneath layers of stone and protective wards that Kate was only now beginning to appreciate. Banks of instruments that combined cutting-edge electrical technology with mechanisms based on principles she couldn't identify lined the walls, while a central table displayed a 3-dimensional map that somehow showed the entire southwestern territory from multiple dimensional perspectives simultaneously. Situation report. Captain Harrison called as Kate entered, his attention focused on readings that painted an increasingly alarming picture. 7 confirmed sites showing synchronized activity, Lieutenant Davis reported, his usual calm strained by the magnitude of what they were observing. Yuma, Casa Grande, Socorro, Las Cruces, Flagstaff, Bakersfield, and the primary node here in Death Valley. The pattern suggests coordinated preparation for a major dimensional event. Dr. Hawthorne looked up from a complex calculation she was performing on a device that resembled a mechanical computer. The energy buildup is following exponential curves that suggest imminent barrier collapse, not gradual weakening, but catastrophic failure that could affect the entire dimensional structure of the region. Kate studied the 3-dimensional map, her analytical mind immediately recognizing the geometric pattern formed by the activated sites. "Captain, these locations aren't random. They form a perfect heptagon with Death Valley at the center. Someone or something is orchestrating this event according to a specific mathematical design." The acceleration Thomas mentioned, Sergeant Major Reeves observed grimly. Industrial activity must have reached a tipping point that's triggered automatic responses from the dimensional management system. Before anyone could respond, the crystalline communication apparatus in the corner of the command center began emitting the harmonic patterns that indicated incoming contact from the higher dimensional network. Thomas's consciousness signature emerged clearly through the interface, but this time his mental voice carried unprecedented urgency. "Katie, the situation is deteriorating faster than anyone anticipated," Thomas communicated directly to her awareness. "The cascade effect has reached the point where intervention is no longer optional. The evolutionary transition must be managed actively, or the failure will propagate beyond this dimensional layer entirely." Kate felt her heart sink as she grasped. "The implications. You're saying the problem isn't limited to our reality?" "The dimensional structure is multi-layered," Thomas explained, his consciousness projecting complex visual concepts that Kate's mind struggled to process. "Failure at our level could destabilize higher dimensions that support multiple reality systems. We're not just facing the transformation of human consciousness, we're facing potential collapse of the entire local dimensional matrix." Captain Harrison stepped closer to the communication apparatus, his expression reflecting the weight of command responsibility. "Thomas, what kind of intervention capability do you have from your position?" "Limited," Thomas admitted. "The higher dimensional network can provide guidance and coordination, but the actual stabilization work must be performed by consciousness that exists primarily in three-dimensional space. We need individuals who can interface with both dimensional layers while maintaining operational capability in your reality." Dr. Hawthorne looked up from her calculations with obvious concern. "How many individuals would be required for effective intervention?" "Minimum viable team would be 12 consciousness-expanded humans working in coordinated formation across the 7 activation sites," Thomas replied. "But training even one person for that level of capability typically requires months of preparation, which we don't have," Lieutenant Davis concluded, consulting readouts that showed continuing acceleration of the dimensional destabilization. Kate felt the crushing weight of impossible mathematics. 7 sites requiring intervention, 12 trained operators needed, and a timeline measured in days rather than months. But her business background had taught her that impossible problems sometimes had solutions that became visible only when conventional approaches were abandoned entirely. "Thomas," she said, "what if we don't try to train 12 people from scratch? What if we work with individuals who are already partially prepared?" "The missing persons," Sergeant Williams said suddenly, understanding Kate's line of thinking. "The people who've disappeared over the past 3 years, some of them might have survived the transformation process." "Exactly," Thomas confirmed, his mental voice carrying excitement at the possibility. "Several consciousness patterns from recent disappearances remain active within the higher dimensional network. With proper interface techniques, they could be reintegrated with three-dimensional operational capability." Dr. Hawthorne began working frantically at her calculating device. "If we could establish contact with even half of the missing persons, and if some of them retained enough individual identity to cooperate with intervention efforts, we could assemble an experienced team instead of training novices," Captain Harrison finished. "But that would require expanding our communication capabilities far beyond current limitations." Kate studied the dimensional map, noting how the 7 activated sites formed connection lines that created a complex geometric pattern across the territory. The sites themselves, they're not just activation points. They're communication nodes in a larger network. If we could access that network directly, We could potentially contact all the transformed consciousness patterns simultaneously, Thomas confirmed. But accessing the network requires physical presence at the primary node during peak activation. Someone would have to serve as a living interface between the three-dimensional command team and the higher dimensional consciousness collective. The implications of what Thomas was suggesting settled over the command center like a funeral shroud. Someone would have to undergo controlled transformation in the middle of a dimensional crisis, maintaining enough individual identity to coordinate a complex rescue and stabilization operation, while their consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations. Mrs. Morrison, Captain Harrison said quietly, I believe your brother is describing a role that only you are positioned to fill. Kate felt the full weight of destiny pressing down on her. Everything in her investigation, every choice that had brought her to Death Valley, had been leading to this moment when humanity's future would depend on decisions made by someone who had started this journey simply trying to find her missing brother. What would be required? She asked, though she suspected the answer would demand everything she was and everything she might have become. Voluntary consciousness expansion under controlled conditions. Dr. Hawthorne explained, her academic training helping her break down the process into manageable concepts. You would undergo the same transformation that affected your brother, but with the support of our protective systems and the guidance of the higher dimensional network. The consciousness expansion isn't reversible, Thomas added gently. Once you cross that threshold, you become something new, still individual, still recognizably yourself, but operating on levels of awareness that normal human consciousness can't sustain. Kate looked around the command center at the faces of people who had already sacrificed conventional lives for this impossible mission. Each had chosen duty over safety, service over personal fulfillment. Now the choice was hers, and the stakes had expanded far beyond personal loss or gain. How long do we have to make this decision? She asked. Sergeant Major Reeves consulted the monitoring equipment with obvious concern. Based on current acceleration rates, dimensional collapse begins within 72 hours. After that, intervention becomes impossible regardless of our capability levels. And if we do nothing? Catastrophic failure propagates through the dimensional matrix, Thomas replied. Not just human extinction, but the collapse of local reality. Systems that support multiple forms of consciousness across several dimensional layers. The magnitude of responsibility was almost crushing, but Kate found herself thinking of all the people whose disappearances she had documented, all the families who had lost loved ones to phenomena they couldn't understand. If there was a chance to prevent further loss, if there was a possibility of giving meaning to all the sacrifices that had already been made. I need to understand the specific procedures, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. What exactly would the transformation involve, and what would my capabilities be afterwards? Dr. Hawthorne opened a thick manual filled with diagrams and technical specifications that seemed to combine medical science with principles that belong to no earthly discipline. The consciousness expansion process requires carefully controlled exposure to higher dimensional energy fields while maintaining life support for your physical form. The crystalline apparatus serves as both interface and protective barrier. Your awareness would expand to encompass multiple dimensional layers simultaneously, Thomas added through the communication link. You would retain individual identity and memory, but gain the ability to perceive and interact with consciousness patterns that exist beyond three-dimensional space. Most importantly, you would be able to coordinate complex operations across multiple reality levels. Captain Harrison studied the tactical displays that showed the continuing destabilization of dimensional barriers. Mrs. Morrison, I want you to understand that what we're asking represents the most dangerous mission anyone in our organization has ever attempted. The failure rate for consciousness expansion under crisis conditions is irrelevant, Kate interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. "Captain, you've shown me that my brother is alive and working to prevent a catastrophe that could destroy everything we've ever cared about. You've revealed that the disappearances I've been investigating are part of humanity's most significant evolutionary challenge. I didn't come this far to retreat when the real work begins." She moved to the three-dimensional map and studied the pattern of activated sites, her analytical mind already beginning to formulate operational approaches. "Thomas, if I undergo the transformation, what's the probability of successfully contacting the missing persons and organizing them into an effective intervention team?" "High probability for contact, moderate probability for successful coordination," Thomas replied honestly. "The consciousness patterns are stable, but they've been isolated from three-dimensional reality for varying periods. Some may have difficulty remembering how to function in normal space-time. Then we'll have to adapt our approach to work with whatever capabilities they retain," Kate concluded. "Dr. Hawthorne, how quickly can the transformation procedure be initiated?" "The apparatus requires of preparation to achieve safe expansion parameters," Dr. Hawthorne replied. "But Mrs. Morrison, once the process begins, there's no turning back. You need to be absolutely certain this is what you want to commit to." Kate Morrison looked around the command center one final time, taking in the faces of people who had become her allies in an impossible war, the instruments that revealed the true scope of humanity's crisis, and the communication link that connected her to a brother whose sacrifice had already shown the path forward. "Dr. Hawthorne," she said, "begin preparations for consciousness expansion. In 12 hours, we're going to save everyone we can and prevent the collapse of reality itself." The determined silence that followed her declaration was broken only by the harmonic resonance of dimensional barriers continuing their inexorable march toward critical failure, and the quiet efficiency of a team preparing for humanity's most important mission. The consciousness expansion procedure began at precisely noon, when Death Valley's brutal sun reached its zenith and the dimensional barriers achieved their most stable configuration. Kate lay within the crystalline apparatus, surrounded by geometric patterns that pulsed with energy drawn from sources that transcended conventional physics. The 12 hours of preparation had revealed the true complexity of what she was attempting, not just personal transformation, but conscious participation in humanity's evolutionary leap across dimensional boundaries. "Final systems check," Dr. Hawthorne announced, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored displays that showed Kate's biological and consciousness parameters. "Neural activity is within acceptable ranges, dimensional resonance is stable, and the protective barriers are fully operational." Captain Harrison stood beside the apparatus, his weathered face reflecting the weight of sending another person across the threshold between realities. "Mrs. Morrison, once the expansion begins, you'll experience reality from perspectives that human consciousness was never designed to handle. Remember that your individual identity is your anchor hold onto who you are, even as you become something more." Kate felt remarkably calm as the harmonic resonance began to build around her. The months of investigation, the days of training, and the hours of preparation had all led to this moment, when personal choice would determine the fate of multiple dimensional layers. "I understand, Captain. Thomas, are you ready to guide me through the transition?" Her brother's consciousness signature strengthened through the communication link, providing a familiar presence as Kate prepared to venture into unknown realms of awareness. "I'm here, Katie. The network is prepared to receive you, and the other transformed consciousness patterns are standing by for contact." The expansion itself was unlike anything Kate could have imagined. Rather than losing herself in alien awareness, she felt her individual identity becoming the core around which vast new layers of perception organized themselves. She remained Kate Morrison, analytical, determined, driven by love for her family and commitment to protecting others. But those characteristics now operated across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The first revelation came as her expanded awareness encountered the consciousness patterns of the missing persons she had spent months trying to locate. They weren't lost or destroyed. They existed in a state of dimensional suspension. Their individual identities preserved, but their operational capabilities limited by lack of proper interface training. "Sarah Chun," Kate called out across the dimensional network, her consciousness recognizing the pattern of a young geologist who had disappeared near Yuma 6 months earlier. "Can you hear me? This is Kate Morrison. I'm here to help coordinate your return to operational status." "Kate Morrison?" Sarah's consciousness responded with astonishment mixed with profound relief. "I remember you from the missing persons reports. But how are you here? Are you dead too?" "Not dead," Kate assured her, while simultaneously maintaining awareness of her physical body in the crystalline apparatus and monitoring the dimensional stability readings that Dr. Hawthorne was calling out from the command center. "Transformed. I'm here to offer you a choice: continue existing in dimensional suspension, or accept expanded consciousness training that will allow you to help prevent a catastrophic reality collapse." The conversation was complicated by the need to communicate across multiple awareness levels simultaneously. Kate found herself explaining the situation to Sarah while also reaching out to other consciousness patterns, coordinating with Thomas and the higher dimensional network, and maintaining real-time awareness of the deteriorating dimensional barriers across all 7 activation sites. "Marcus Webb," she called to the consciousness pattern of a railroad surveyor who had vanished near Socorro. "Patricia Flores, James Richardson, Michael Santos, all of you who have been trapped between realities. I'm offering you the chance to serve a purpose that gives meaning to your transformation." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 17 distinct consciousness patterns that Kate had documented as missing persons reached out simultaneously, their individual awareness expanding as they accepted the interface training that Thomas and the higher dimensional network provided. Each retained their essential identity while gaining capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. But as the expanded team formed, Kate began to perceive deeper truths about the dimensional crisis that changed everything she thought. She understood about their mission. The industrial acceleration that had triggered the cascade effect wasn't random technological development. It was the result of systematic intervention by consciousness patterns from failed evolutionary cycles. Previous iterations of human civilization that had undergone catastrophic transformation failures were actively working to prevent similar disasters by accelerating current human development beyond safe parameters. "Thomas," Kate communicated. Across the network, her awareness now encompassing information flows that revealed the true scope of the crisis. The acceleration isn't caused by railroad technology interfering with natural evolution. It's being caused by transformed consciousness. Patterns from civilizations that collapsed during previous evolutionary attempts. "What are you seeing, Katie?" Thomas responded, his own awareness expanding to examine the data Kate was accessing. "They're terrified," Kate realized, her consciousness touching the edges of vast collective trauma that spanned millennia. Previous human civilizations that failed the evolutionary transition exist as fragmented consciousness networks, desperate to prevent other iterations from experiencing the same catastrophic collapse they endured. The revelation reframed the entire crisis. The mysterious acceleration wasn't malevolent interference. It was misguided assistance from previous versions of humanity that had learned the wrong lessons from their own failures. Their intervention was creating the very conditions they sought to prevent. "Dr. Hawthorne," Kate called out across dimensional boundaries to the command center. "The source of the acceleration has been identified. We're dealing with traumatized consciousness remnants from failed evolutionary cycles. They're trying to help, but their intervention is destabilizing our transition process." Dr. Hawthorne's voice reached Kate through multiple awareness channels. Can you communicate with these remnant consciousnesses? Convince them to cease their intervention? Kate extended her awareness beyond the local dimensional matrix, seeking contact with the fragmented networks that were driving the crisis. What she encountered was unlike anything she had experienced: vast, ancient consciousness patterns fractured by evolutionary failure and driven by guilt and desperation to prevent others from suffering their fate. "We failed," the ancient patterns communicated when Kate's awareness touched theirs. Dimensional collapse, reality fragmentation, consciousness dissolution. "We will not allow others to experience our failure. Acceleration necessary. Evolution must be forced before barriers collapse naturally." "But the acceleration is causing the very collapse you're trying to prevent," Kate replied, projecting understanding and compassion across the vast gulf of time and suffering that separated her from these ancient consciousness fragments. "Your intervention is creating cascade effects that threaten the entire dimensional matrix." The response was immediate and agonizing. Waves of grief and self-recrimination from consciousness patterns that had spent eons believing they were providing salvation while actually creating destruction. We have caused this. Our assistance is the source of failure." "Not failure," Kate corrected gently, her awareness encompassing both their pain and the possibilities for resolution. "Miscalculation based on incomplete understanding. But the situation can be corrected if you're willing to coordinate with us instead of acting independently." Working with Thomas and the expanded team of recovered consciousness patterns, Kate began implementing a solution that had never been attempted before: active cooperation between current evolutionary cycles and remnants from previous attempts. Instead of forcing acceleration or resisting change, they would guide the transition at its natural pace while providing support structures that prevented the catastrophic failures that had destroyed earlier civilizations. "Marcus, Sarah, Patricia, all of you," Kate coordinated with the recovered missing persons. "We need to establish stabilization matrices at each of the 7 activation sites. The ancient consciousness patterns will provide historical knowledge of failure modes, while we maintain operational capability in current dimensional space." The coordination required managing awareness across more dimensional layers than human consciousness had ever attempted to process. Kate found herself simultaneously directing operations at 7 geographic locations, facilitating communication between consciousness patterns separated by millennia, and maintaining the delicate balance of forces that prevented dimensional collapse. "Captain Harrison," she communicated to the command center, "I need you to coordinate physical world operations while we handle the dimensional stabilization. The ancient patterns are providing technical specifications for permanent barrier enhancement, but implementation requires 3-dimensional construction at each site." "Understood," Captain Harrison replied, his voice reaching Kate across multiple awareness levels. "Teams are already en route to the 6 external sites. Dr. Hawthorne is coordinating construction based on the specifications you're transmitting." But even as the stabilization operation proceeded, Kate became aware of an even deeper truth about humanity's evolutionary journey. The consciousness expansion they were experiencing wasn't a single transformation, it was part of an ongoing cycle that would continue for countless generations. Each successful evolutionary transition created the foundation for subsequent developments that reached toward ever greater integration with higher dimensional reality. "Thomas," she shared this revelation with her brother, "we're not just preventing collapse, we're establishing the infrastructure for continuous evolution that prevents the stagnation and failure that affected previous cycles." "The network sees it too," Thomas confirmed. "Instead of dramatic transitions that succeed or fail catastrophically, we're creating gradual development pathways that allow consciousness to evolve safely across extended time frames." The ancient consciousness patterns began to understand what Kate and her team were accomplishing. Instead of forcing immediate transformation or preventing change entirely, They were creating sustainable evolutionary processes that honored both the need for advancement and the requirement for stability. We can be part of healing rather than trauma, the ancient patterns communicated with wonder. Our knowledge of failure can become wisdom for success. As the stabilization matrices came online at all 7 sites, Kate felt the dimensional barriers achieving a new configuration, not rigid separation between realities, but flexible membranes that allowed controlled interaction while preventing catastrophic cascade effects. The immediate crisis was resolving, but more importantly, humanity had gained the infrastructure necessary for managed evolution that could continue safely for centuries. Katie, Thomas's consciousness touched hers with profound gratitude. You've accomplished something that none of us thought possible. You've turned evolutionary crisis into evolutionary opportunity. Kate Morrison felt her expanded awareness encompassing not just her own transformation, but the future possibilities for human consciousness that stretched across dimensions and generations. She remained herself analytical, determined, protective of others, but now those qualities operated as part of a vast network dedicated to helping humanity reach its full potential without repeating the failures of the past. The truth had been unveiled in ways that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations, revealing that the greatest adventures in human history were just beginning. The stabilization operation had been proceeding smoothly for 18 hours, when everything went catastrophically wrong. Kate's expanded consciousness, coordinating operations across 7 sites while maintaining contact with 17 recovered consciousness patterns and ancient trauma fragments, suddenly detected an anomaly that threatened to unravel everything they had accomplished. Thomas. She called across the dimensional network, her awareness recoiling from contact with something vast and hostile that had been lurking undetected within the wagon, higher dimensional matrix. There's something else here, something that's not part of the evolutionary cycle at all. The response came not from her brother, but from an intelligence so alien that Kate's hybrid consciousness could barely process its communication patterns. Unlike the ancient human fragments or the evolved consciousness network, this entity existed entirely outside the framework of terrestrial evolution. Interference patterns detected. The alien intelligence projected with cold, analytical precision that reminded Kate uncomfortably of her own methodical approach to problem solving. Local reality matrix shows unauthorized modifications, correction protocols initiating. Kate felt her expanded awareness being probed by consciousness patterns that operated according to principles that had nothing to do with human development. The entity or entities, as she began to realize there were multiple intelligences operating in coordination, viewed the dimensional stabilization work as contamination of a system they had been monitoring for purposes she couldn't fathom. Dr. Hawthorne. Kate projected her voice across dimensional boundaries to the command center, while simultaneously coordinating with the recovered consciousness patterns to establish defensive positions around the 7 sites. We're dealing with non-terrestrial intelligence that considers our evolutionary work to be unauthorized modification of local reality. The crystalline apparatus began resonating with harmonics that indicated extreme stress on the dimensional interface systems. Kate could feel her physical body in the command center, even as her consciousness operated across multiple reality layers, and she realized that the alien entities were attempting to sever her connection between dimensional states. System integrity compromised. The alien intelligence continued its analytical assessment. Consciousness patterns showing unauthorized expansion beyond baseline parameters. Remedial action required to restore original configuration. The implications of this communication struck Kate like a physical blow. The alien entities weren't malevolent in any human sense. They were maintenance systems, operating according to protocols that treated human consciousness as a carefully regulated experiment that was now showing signs of uncontrolled development. Captain Harrison, She communicated to the command center while her awareness fought to maintain connection across increasingly unstable dimensional boundaries. The aliens aren't invaders, they're overseers. They've been monitoring human evolution as part of some kind of controlled experiment, and our consciousness expansion is triggering automatic correction responses. Through the chaos of dimensional interference, Kate heard Captain Harrison's voice from the command center. "Mrs. Morrison, your consciousness patterns are becoming increasingly unstable. The alien interference is disrupting the interface matrices that anchor your individual identity." Kate felt the truth of his warning as her expanded awareness began to fragment under pressure from correction. Protocols designed to reduce human consciousness back to baseline parameters. The 17 recovered consciousness patterns were experiencing similar interference, their hybrid capabilities degrading as the alien systems worked to restore what they considered normal operational limits. "Thomas," she called desperately across the network, "can the higher dimensional collective resist the correction protocols?" "We're trying," Thomas replied, his consciousness signature strained by efforts to maintain network integrity against systematic dismantling. "But the alien systems have authority codes that override our resistance. They're operating with permissions that predate the establishment of the consciousness network itself." Kate realized that they were facing the ultimate confrontation, not just with forces that threatened dimensional stability, but with the cosmic authority that had originally established the conditions for human evolution. The alien intelligence represented management systems that viewed consciousness expansion as unauthorized deviation from experimental parameters. But even as her awareness fragmented under alien correction protocols, Kate's analytical mind continued processing the massive data flows she had been monitoring. The pattern of alien intervention revealed critical information about the true nature of humanity's situation. "The consciousness expansion isn't deviation from the experiment," she projected with desperate clarity to the alien intelligence. "It's the intended outcome of the experimental process. Your correction protocols are interfering with successful completion of the evolutionary project." The alien response came with mechanical precision. "Experimental parameters indicate consciousness development limited to three-dimensional awareness with minimal dimensional interface capability. Current patterns exceed authorized limits by factors requiring immediate remediation." Kate felt her individual identity beginning to dissolve under the pressure of correction protocols, but her analytical training provided one final insight that could change the entire confrontation. "Thomas, the ancient consciousness fragments, they have memory access to the original experimental setup. Can they provide authorization codes that predate the correction protocols?" Through the chaos of dimensional interference, the ancient consciousness patterns that had caused the acceleration crisis began to understand their role in resolving it. Their trauma from evolutionary failure had made them forget, but they retained deep memory access to the original establishment of human consciousness as an experimental system. "We remember," the ancient patterns communicated with growing clarity. "The parameters. They were never meant to be permanent limits. They were initial conditions for a development process that was supposed to evolve beyond three-dimensional constraints." The alien intelligence paused its correction protocols as authorization codes older than the consciousness network itself began to assert priority over maintenance routines. Kate felt her fragmenting awareness stabilizing as the true experimental parameters became clear to the oversight systems. Original authorization confirmed. The alien intelligence acknowledged with what might have been surprise in a human context. Consciousness expansion protocol authorized under primary experimental directives. Correction protocols withdrawn. But the reprieve came with unexpected complications. The withdrawal of correction protocols didn't just stop the interference, it activated support systems that had been dormant for millennia, designed to facilitate consciousness expansion beyond anything Kate and her team had attempted. "Enhancement protocols initiating," the alien intelligence announced. Consciousness. Development acceleration to achieve experimental completion within optimal timeframes. Kate felt her awareness expanding beyond even the hybrid state she had achieved, her individual identity becoming the nucleus around which vast cosmic consciousness organized itself. The 17 recovered consciousness patterns underwent similar enhancement, their capabilities magnifying to levels that transcended not just human limitations, but the constraints of local dimensional space. Too much, too fast, Thomas warned across the network. The enhancement protocols are designed for consciousness that's had millennia to prepare for cosmic integration. Forced acceleration at this level could result in complete dissolution of individual identity. Kate realized that they had traded one crisis for another. Instead of forced reduction to baseline consciousness, they now faced forced elevation to cosmic awareness that could destroy everything that made them recognizably human. The alien oversight systems were as capable of causing catastrophic failure through excessive assistance as through corrective interference. Dr. Hawthorne, Kate projected to the command center while fighting to maintain individual identity against cosmic integration pressures. I need you to overload the crystalline apparatus. Create dimensional static that will disrupt both the correction protocols and the enhancement systems. That could kill you, Dr. Hawthorne replied, her voice tight with concern. Dimensional static during consciousness expansion typically results in complete severance from physical reality. Better than cosmic dissolution, Kate replied, her awareness already beginning to merge with intelligence networks that spanned galactic clusters. Do it now, before I lose the ability to remember who I am. The overload created chaos across all dimensional layers, disrupting both alien oversight systems and the consciousness networks that had been facilitating human evolution. Kate felt her cosmic awareness collapsing back toward individual identity, but the process was neither controlled nor predictable. When the dimensional static cleared, Kate found herself existing in a state she couldn't have imagined, neither fully human nor fully evolved, but occupying a unique position that allowed her to interface with alien oversight systems while maintaining connection to terrestrial consciousness networks. Status report, she called to her team, her awareness now encompassing both cosmic perspectives and human concerns in ways that created unprecedented analytical capability. All consciousness patterns stable, Thomas reported with obvious relief. The dimensional static disrupted the alien enhancement protocols while preserving the individual identity anchors that keep us recognizably human. The alien intelligence seemed to recalibrate its approach based on the unexpected results of the enhancement attempt. Consciousness patterns demonstrate unique adaptation characteristics, requesting clarification of optimal development parameters. Kate realized that the confrontation had evolved into negotiation. The alien oversight systems weren't malevolent or inflexible, they were management protocols designed to facilitate successful experimental outcomes. The challenge was communicating what success actually meant from a human perspective. Optimal development maintains individual identity while enabling collective capability. Kate communicated to the alien intelligence, her unique position allowing translation between cosmic and terrestrial consciousness frameworks. Enhancement should expand capability without destroying the consciousness characteristics that define successful human evolution. Parameters updated, the alien intelligence replied. Experimental oversight modified to support graduated development with identity preservation safeguards. The resolution came not through victory over alien authority, but through successful communication that aligned oversight protocols with human evolutionary needs. The aliens weren't conquerors or guardians, they were cosmic scientists ensuring that consciousness development experiments achieved their intended outcomes without causing systemic damage to local reality matrices. Captain Harrison, Kate communicated to the command center, her new state allowing her to maintain physical awareness while operating across multiple dimensional layers. The immediate crisis is resolved. But the real work is just beginning. We've gained access to cosmic development resources that could accelerate human evolution safely across centuries. As the confrontation concluded, Kate Morrison found herself occupying a position that had never existed before, a bridge between terrestrial consciousness and cosmic intelligence that could facilitate humanity's development according to both human values and universal principles. The battle for survival had become the foundation for unprecedented opportunity, but the choices ahead would determine whether humanity used its new capabilities to enhance its best characteristics or lose itself in the vastness of cosmic consciousness. 6 months after the dimensional crisis, Kate Morrison stood on the observation deck of what had once been the secret settlement beneath Death Valley, watching the sunrise paint the alkali flats in shades of gold and crimson that no human eye had ever perceived before her transformation. The landscape remained as harsh and forbidding as ever, but her enhanced awareness could see the invisible networks of energy that now connected Death Valley to consciousness development centers across 3 continents. The changes were subtle but profound. Where once the valley had been a place of mystery and disappearance, it had become humanity's first official institute for consciousness research, jointly operated by the U.S. territorial government and what the public knew only as the International Scientific Cooperation Council. The alien oversight systems, working through Kate's unique translational capabilities, had provided technological advances that seemed like natural human discoveries to outside observers. Morning briefing, Director Morrison. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne announced as she joined Kate on the observation deck, carrying reports that detailed the previous day's developments across the Global Consciousness Research Network. The title still felt strange to Kate, though she had grown into the role of bridging cosmic intelligence with human institutional structures. Status report from the 7 primary sites? Kate asked, her awareness already encompassing the electromagnetic readings from Yuma, Casa Grande, Socorro, Las Cruces, Flagstaff, and Bakersfield, where similar research facilities had been established. Under cover of geological survey stations and railroad development projects. All sites reporting stable dimensional interface activity. Dr. Hawthorne replied, consulting documents that contained information no conventional scientist could have compiled. The Graduated Consciousness Expansion Program has successfully processed 43 volunteers over the past 6 months, with 0 casualties and complete retention of individual identity in all cases. This represented a revolutionary achievement that would have seemed impossible during the crisis. Working with the alien oversight systems, Kate and her team had developed protocols that allowed safe consciousness expansion over periods of weeks, rather than the dangerous instant transformation that had characterized earlier attempts. Each volunteer underwent careful psychological preparation, gradual exposure to higher dimensional awareness, and continuous monitoring to ensure their essential humanity remained intact. Any word from Thomas and the Advanced Consciousness Network? Kate inquired, though her enhanced awareness was already touching the edges of her brother's presence across dimensional boundaries. The integration project continues ahead of schedule, Dr. Hawthorne reported with satisfaction. Thomas and the 17 recovered consciousness patterns have successfully established communication protocols with 12 different cosmic intelligence networks. The Knowledge Exchange Program is providing technological advances that will benefit human development for generations. Kate smiled as she felt Thomas's consciousness touch hers across dimensional space, their sibling connection now enhanced by shared understanding of realities that transcended normal human experience. He remained recognizably her brother, thoughtful, scientifically curious, protective of others, but those characteristics now operated as part of a vast collaborative intelligence, dedicated to facilitating consciousness development across multiple species and dimensional frameworks. Katie, Thomas's voice reached her through channels that bypassed conventional communication. The cosmic networks have approved the next phase of human integration. They're offering access to consciousness development techniques that could safely accelerate human evolution by centuries. What would that involve? Kate replied, her unique position allowing her to translate between Thomas's cosmic perspective and the practical considerations that governed human institutional development. Establishing consciousness research centers in major population areas. Thomas explained, his awareness projecting complex visual concepts that Kate's hybrid consciousness could interpret and translate for a three-dimensional understanding. New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo locations where advanced consciousness techniques could be introduced, gradually through what appear to be conventional educational and medical programs. The implications were staggering. Instead of limiting consciousness expansion to remote facilities like Death Valley, humanity could begin integrating advanced awareness techniques into mainstream society, creating a gradual evolution that preserved cultural stability while opening unprecedented developmental possibilities. Dr. Hawthorne, Kate said, I need you to coordinate with Captain Harrison on establishing contact with federal authorities. We're going to propose expansion of the consciousness research program to major urban centers. The captain himself appeared on the observation deck at that moment, his bearing reflecting the profound changes that had affected everyone involved in the dimensional crisis. Samuel Harrison remained the competent military professional he had always been, but his understanding of duty now encompassed responsibilities that extended far beyond territorial security to include humanity's role in a cosmic community of consciousness. Mrs. Morrison, he said, I've received preliminary approval from the territorial governor for expanded operations. The federal government is prepared to authorize consciousness research facilities in 5 major cities, provided we can demonstrate the same safety standards we've achieved here in Death Valley. Kate felt a surge of satisfaction at this confirmation that their work was achieving recognition at the highest levels of human authority. But more importantly, it represented validation of the approach they had developed: gradual integration of advanced consciousness techniques with existing human institutions, rather than revolutionary upheaval that could destabilize society. What about international coordination? Kate asked, her awareness encompassing communication networks that now extended across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, through consciousness-enhanced telegraph systems that operated according to principles the public attributed to improved electrical engineering. The European Scientific Consortium has expressed formal interest in establishing parallel programs, Captain Harrison reported. They've experienced their own version of unexplained phenomena, similar disappearances, electromagnetic anomalies, and reports of dimensional instabilities. Dr. Hawthorne's research papers have provided them with theoretical frameworks for understanding these incidents as natural evolutionary pressures rather than supernatural threats. Dr. Hawthorne looked up from her reports with obvious pride. The academic community has been remarkably receptive to consciousness research when it's presented as advanced psychology and neurology rather than paranormal investigation. We're essentially introducing cosmic science through conventional academic channels. This represented perhaps their most significant achievement, the integration of higher dimensional knowledge with human intellectual traditions in ways that enhanced rather than replaced existing educational and scientific frameworks. Students at universities across the country were now learning consciousness expansion techniques as advanced meditation practices, while medical schools were incorporating dimensional awareness training as cutting-edge therapeutic approaches. Any challenges from traditional religious institutions? Kate inquired, aware that consciousness expansion could be perceived as threatening to conventional spiritual authorities. Quite the opposite, Dr. Hawthorne replied with a smile. Many religious leaders have recognized consciousness research as scientific validation of spiritual traditions they've maintained for centuries. We're finding remarkable compatibility between ancient mystical practices and advanced dimensional awareness techniques. This compatibility had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past 6 months. Instead of creating conflict between science and spirituality, consciousness research was revealing the underlying unity of human approaches to transcendent experience. Meditation practices developed by Buddhist monks, contemplative techniques perfected by Christian mystics, and shamanic traditions maintained by indigenous peoples all contained elements that resonated with cosmic consciousness principles. Private Jackson approached the group, his youthful face reflecting the wonder that still characterized his reaction to the extraordinary developments he helped facilitate. Director Morrison were receiving communication from the San Francisco facility. They're requesting consultation on 3 volunteers who are showing unusual adaptation patterns during consciousness expansion procedures. Kate extended her awareness across the dimensional network to examine the situation at the California facility, her unique capabilities allowing her to assess consciousness development patterns from any location connected to the research network. What she perceived was encouraging rather than concerning individuals whose natural consciousness characteristics were proving particularly compatible with advanced awareness techniques. Natural talents, she diagnosed immediately. People whose consciousness development has been proceeding independently through dreams, meditation, or intuitive experiences. Dr. Hawthorne, we should establish accelerated training protocols for individuals who show spontaneous consciousness expansion capabilities. This represented another crucial development in their understanding of human evolutionary potential. Rather than forcing consciousness expansion on unprepared minds, they were learning to recognize and nurture natural developmental processes that were occurring throughout the human population. Some individuals were spontaneously developing enhanced awareness through life experiences that opened their consciousness to higher dimensional influences. Thomas, Kate communicated across dimensional boundaries. The cosmic networks were correct about human evolutionary readiness. We're finding natural consciousness expansion occurring much more frequently than anyone anticipated. The networks are aware, Thomas replied, his cosmic perspective encompassing development patterns across the entire species. Human consciousness has been preparing for this transition for generations through art, literature, scientific discovery, and spiritual practice. The formal consciousness expansion program is simply providing structure for development that was already proceeding naturally. This understanding reframed their entire mission from forcing evolutionary change to facilitating natural developmental processes that were already underway. Instead of creating consciousness expansion capabilities, they were providing safe frameworks for abilities that humans were developing independently through their engagement with reality's deeper mysteries. Captain Harrison, Kate said, I recommend we establish identification protocols for natural consciousness expansion. Instead of recruiting volunteers for experimental procedures, we should be offering support services for people who are already experiencing spontaneous awareness enhancement. That could revolutionize our approach entirely, Captain Harrison acknowledged. Instead of consciousness research facilities, we could establish consciousness support networks that help people understand and integrate experiences they're already having. The implications extended far beyond their immediate program. If natural consciousness expansion was occurring throughout the human population, then their role was not to create evolutionary change, but to ensure it proceeded safely and constructively. They could become guides for a transformation that was already underway rather than initiators of unprecedented development. Dr. Hawthorne consulted her research notes with obvious excitement. If we're correct about the prevalence of natural consciousness expansion, then we should find evidence in historical records, accounts of individuals throughout history who demonstrated capabilities that conventional understanding couldn't explain. There are extensive records, Kate confirmed, her enhanced awareness allowing her to access information networks that span both human documentation and cosmic intelligence archives. artists who painted impossible visions, scientists who made discoveries through inexplicable intuition, explorers who navigated by awareness that transcended normal perception. Human consciousness has been evolving toward cosmic integration for centuries. This revelation transformed their understanding of human history itself. The great achievements of human civilization, artistic masterpieces, scientific breakthroughs, philosophical insights, technological innovations might represent the products of consciousness that was already expanding beyond three-dimensional limitations. They weren't creating human potential so much as providing structure for potential that had always existed. Thomas, Kate communicated to her brother, "Are we documenting the beginning of human consciousness expansion, or are we documenting the completion of a process that's been underway for millennia?" "Both," Thomas replied, his cosmic awareness encompassing temporal perspectives that transcended normal chronological understanding. Human consciousness has been developing toward cosmic integration since the species first achieved self-awareness. But the formal recognition and systematic support of that development represents a crucial transition point that determines whether the process continues successfully or encounters obstacles that could delay progress for centuries. Kate felt the weight of this responsibility settling over her like a mantle of purpose that encompassed not just her own transformation, but humanity's entire evolutionary trajectory. The choices made during this transition period would determine whether consciousness expansion became a natural part of human development or remained an exceptional capability limited to a few individuals. "Dr. Hawthorne, Captain Harrison," she announced, "we're going to restructure our entire program. Instead of consciousness research facilities, we're establishing consciousness education networks. Instead of experimental procedures, we're developing support curricula for natural awareness enhancement. Instead of recruiting volunteers, we're training guides who can help people understand experiences they're already having." The transformation of their mission reflected Kate's growing understanding of her unique position as a bridge between cosmic intelligence and human development. She wasn't just facilitating individual consciousness expansion. She was helping humanity recognize and embrace evolutionary capabilities that were already emerging throughout the species. As the sun reached its zenith over Death Valley, Kate Morrison looked out across landscapes that had been transformed from places of mystery and danger into centers of human potential development. The harsh beauty of the desert remained unchanged, but it now served as the foundation for humanity's greatest adventure, the conscious evolution of awareness itself. "Thomas," she communicated to her brother across dimensional boundaries, "what do you see when you look at humanity's future from cosmic perspective?" "I see a species on the verge of joining a galactic community of consciousness," Thomas replied, his awareness encompassing possibilities that stretched across centuries and star systems. "I see human creativity and determination enhanced by cosmic wisdom, creating contributions to universal development that no other species has achieved. I see the beginning of adventures that will make our journey to Death Valley seem like the first step of an infinite exploration." Kate Morrison smiled as she contemplated the journey that had brought her from a Massachusetts textile mill to the frontiers of cosmic consciousness. She had come to Death Valley seeking her missing brother and had discovered humanity's missing potential. The transformation was complete, but the real adventure was just beginning. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, the sound of progress and possibility moving forward into a future where the impossible had become not just possible, but inevitable. Kate Morrison, director of Humanity's Consciousness Development Institute, stood ready to guide her species toward a destiny that transcended every limitation they had ever imagined. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.